Welcome back to the City Current Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you inspiring stories of individuals and organizations making a difference and powering the good. And in this case, we're talking about MemWorks, and we have some important updates to share. We're honored to be joined by Jared Barnett, CEO of Slingshot Memphis, and also John Martinez, Vice President and Director of Program Development with MDRC. How are you two doing?
Doing fantastic.
Doing great. Really happy to be here today.
Well, last time we had you on, we were giving some perspective on the partnership, the collaboration, the research, and MemWorks, and now we get to present some findings and some updates. So very exciting for what it means for our community. But let's start with a little bit of background, a little bit of context for those who missed the first interview. Let's start, Jared, on your end. Give us some background on Slingshot Memphis, and then we'll dive in deeper.
Yeah, so Slingshot Memphis is helping us answer the question, what's effective at alleviating poverty? And so we've got our methodology we've been using now in Memphis since 2017, and we're working with 51 nonprofits across the community and able to help those nonprofits understand what they're being effective at and how they can be more effective, but then also sharing that with the community via our website so others can know what's being effective in the community so that we can make sure our philanthropy has as much impact as possible and really change the trajectory of poverty in the city.
And I think that for me personally is one of the things I love the most is you always want to know, is it working? And so as a business, you invest your resources and you're looking for an ROI and you want to make sure that it's working. And that's exactly what you're doing when it comes to the philanthropy is working alongside the nonprofits, focusing on education, figuring out what's working, how do we leverage that, and then bringing along those resources so that you can accelerate the opportunity to make a difference and lift our community, especially when it comes to poverty fighting. John, let's switch over and get some perspective on your end. And, one of the cool updates recently is you're now a part of the board. And so you've joined the board with Slingshot Memphis, but give us some background and some vantage point on your end.
Great. Thanks. Really appreciate that, Jeremy. And yes, I am now part of the board of Slingshot. And I think that just demonstrates the deepening partnership between MDRC and Slingshot Memphis. So MDRC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan social policy research firm. So what does that mean? What we try and do is we build rigorous evidence around what policies are effective in terms of changing the trajectories for people who are low income, and use that evidence to try and inform and improve policy, but also to inform and improve practice. So how can organizations like Slingshot, how can cities like Memphis use that evidence to help inform the decisions they're making to provide services to folks that could really benefit and improve their lives?
And I go back to when you look at this collaborative partnership, you have one hyper-focused local lifting out of poverty, and you have one that has a national perspective that you can bring in best practices and research and everything else too. So a great collaboration on both sides with a shared heart and mission for really lifting, especially here locally in the Mid-South. And so, Jared, give us some perspective on MemWorks, and then we'll start diving into the findings.
Yeah, so the whole context of MemWorks was to answer, why do we have 25% of our populations experiencing poverty? And so many employers complaining about being able to find and retain a workforce. You would think those things would naturally resolve each other, right? We don't have a lack of jobs. We don't have a lack of people who need jobs, but something's not working and connecting them. And so MemWorks is focused exclusively on what are the root causes of those reasons, right? Specifically for the populations experiencing poverty. We're not so much focused on people who want a career change or, the middle income and above, but that population that often gets overlooked when we think about workforce development. And we're really trying to understand that. And then the second piece is then what can we do about it, right? So we're not just here to poke holes and say, oh, this isn't working, but we want to bring the research and evidence-based approaches that both our organizations contribute to help Memphis understand what can we now do now that we know the true roadblocks, these true root causes of why these pathways to employment aren't working, and then say what's effective at addressing those.
Let's go ahead and dive into the findings, because even for me, just kind of glancing through some of the information that you share with me, it's interesting because in some cases you think, oh, well, maybe they don't have a high school education, and so education is a big barrier. And yet when you look at it, 75% of people experience poverty have a high school diploma, 40% have some college experience. And so really interesting when you look at what the research is showing. But John, let's start on your end. Where do you like to start as you're sharing the story of the findings with MemWorks? Where do you like to start?
One of the things that I think is most exciting about this is bringing, what we know from a national perspective around what are some of the barriers, what are some of the challenges that prevent people from being able to move into training programs that have the potential to help them connect and move up in the labor market, right? One of the strengths of MemWorks is taking what we know from that national lens and really focusing in on what can we say about Memphis? What does the data say about Memphis in terms of what those roadblocks, what those challenges, what those barriers are? And I think that's a really powerful thing about MemWorks, because we could have just come in and said, well, when we look at things nationally, here are 2 or 3 things that we know are real challenges. But what does that mean for the Memphis context? And if we want to develop solutions, we have to really understand what the challenges are within Memphis. And so that's where I really like to start in terms of thinking a little bit about what are some of the challenges, what are some of the roadblocks that kind of prevent people from being able to, move up, connect to, and move up in the labor market. And so that's where our work really started, was looking at that data and trying to dig into what are the things that are emerging that the data suggests really prevent people from being able to make those connections. And through our work, we were able to identify 10 what we're calling roadblocks across a range of issues that have relevance for Memphis. And I think today we're probably going to dig in a little bit more into 5 of those roadblocks. But before we did that, Jared, I wanted to see if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the population before we dig into some of the findings.
Yeah, so before we kind of dive into what the problems are, we wanted to say, what's that starting point, right? What are people who are experiencing poverty? Where is their condition today? So we understand where they need to get to. Again, letting the data drive that as a starting point, and then supplementing that with the lived experience later on. And so you brought up one, Jeremy, right? That kind of mind-boggling. A lot of times I think about people experiencing poverty, and if we have such a large percent, it's because they didn't finish high school and some of those things. And that's just not true in Memphis. And some of the things that we've heard from, for instance, from technical education providers, is that they can't use a high school diploma as a determination if someone can read at a level that allows them to comprehend the curriculum for their training program. And so they have to find other ways of trying to understand if those applicants are able to actually comprehend the material and there. And so we're pretty confident that there's at least 100,000 Memphians who aren't able to read or do math at a level that will allow them to either perform the responsibilities of a living wage job or to take technical training that would enable them to get to those jobs. And to me, that was very sobering, because I can't think of something that's much more kind of damning in your progression professionally if you're not able to read at a level that allows you to even get into those entry points, right? So our issue is not, do we have enough, more techs and Tech 901s and TCATs? It's, are we doing what's needed to help people get to a sufficient literacy level so they can get into those opportunities in the first place and be successful? So that was one area that was really kind of just, again, sobering. Another one was around kind of just the how many people are impacted by this. So we're confident there's about 200,000 people in Memphis who are not earning a living wage right now. So that's a third of the Memphis proper, are not earning a living wage. And if you try and contextualize that, if you take a single parent, right, who has 2 children, and say they're earning a job at the minimum wage, which in Tennessee is the national minimum wage of about $7.25, they're going to have to work 80 hours a week, every week, just to pass the threshold of not being, below a living wage. Now, what that doesn't do, though, is it doesn't take into account the cost of childcare, the cost of transportation, some of these other challenges we know that exist here. But it's pretty sobering to think that someone has to work that much at a minimum wage job in order to be anywhere near what a living wage would be, right? Which shows that clearly we need to get people into jobs that are much more transformative, right? And are helping them build skills to get into those jobs that, will value those skill sets.
And I think, people go back to then, well, why do we have these issues in the Mid-South, and why do we have them nationally? And when you look at it, well, what does that mean for a family, especially for a single mother who has to basically work 80 hours or have 2 full-time jobs just to make the ends meet, just to be able to have a place to live, to be able to put food on the table. And yet the kids don't have a parent at home, don't have the support network in place, can't afford the childcare. So, I mean, all of these things factor into what we're facing as a community, and also why we as a community have to care about everyone and lift from all sides. So I think that also is, back to listeners and viewers saying, well, why does this matter? It deeply matters because we're all in this together. And so talk about then some of the things, John, or, Jared, I'll kind of let you bounce back and forth. But when you talk about those 10 factors and diving in deep to maybe 5, where do we want to start?
Sure. So Jared already touched on one, which is, this idea of the challenges around math proficiency, literacy proficiency. That's a barrier that for folks to be able to enter into a lot of these training programs that could provide opportunities for them to move up in the labor market and to actually complete those. But I think an additional barrier there is, so what that means is you might have to provide some remedial education services to kind of help folks get to the point where they can succeed in those training programs. The challenge is there just aren't enough slots for those kinds of programs in Memphis. And so when we looked at some of the numbers, we estimated that given the existing kind of literacy and numeracy organizations in Memphis, they'd probably only be able to serve about 5% of those that really need it. That, again, is a very sobering statistic. If you can't even get the basic skills you need to be able to get into these training programs, that can be a real roadblock in terms of being able to connect to and move up in the labor market. Another issue that we identified that I think touches on something that you mentioned, Jeremy, is this idea of the lack of resources. We all know that there can be like various challenges to being able to get to training programs to get to work. You might have a flat tire, or your car might break down, your childcare falls through. But when you're a person who's living in poverty, those kinds of factors can compound. And so I think, assumption often is, well, big deal, you have a flat tire, just go get it fixed and then you can kind of deal with it. But when you're dealing with and struggling with a lot of these resource constraints, they can really kind of pile up and lead to real barriers and challenges and resource constraints in terms of being able to be successful. And the statistics really support this. I mean, when we looked at the data in 2015 cohort, only 2 in 10 community college students graduated within 6 years in Shelby County. 2 in 10. That is a very sobering statistic, and that's half the national average. So it really points to a real challenge within the Memphis community that's really ripe to be addressed. Jared, I'll kick it over to you to cover some of the other ones that came out.
Yeah, so another one here that we've uncovered is just the lack of coordination between our workforce organizations, right? So for instance, we try to say, hey, let's go out and identify all the different workforce organizations in Memphis so we can understand them. And we found about 130 organizations, and it took us a couple weeks to find them. And we're still trying to figure out what are all the services they offer, where are they located, what times of day are their services available. And it is a nightmare just even trying to find workforce organizations, let alone have these organizations work together. So if I'm someone seeking these services, I can say, oh, I can call this organization and go here. And I know that if I get this service here, I can get this help over here. In my view, based on experience of trying to do this with our team, I don't know how someone can say, all right, I want to access workforce services that'll help me, reach a living wage job and be able to effectively navigate without having a lot of help doing that. Because it's a nightmare trying to figure that out. And then you have redundant services, you have services not offered where they're needed. You have gaps in services. We talk about transportation, which is one of the 10 roadblocks we've identified. But another sobering statistic here is that 70% of the workforce organizations in the city are actually located in zip codes that have an average income of $50,000 or above, which isn't necessarily where they're needed the most. And so, depending on how far those are and what transportations are, a lot of these service providers aren't always where they're most needed. And so even though they might exist, they aren't accessible by, again, the population who's going to disproportionately benefit from it.
So as you start putting together, okay, we've identified and we're identifying these gaps and these challenges, but now we're trying to put out solutions. Give us one or two of the solutions that you're already starting to bubble up with on your end.
Yeah, so I'm happy to run with what John talked about, right? When you think about, kind of technical training or post-secondary persistence, right? We have 20%, right? 2 out of 10 that graduated from that 2015 cohort in 6 years. Well, what we've seen is that a pilot in East Tennessee, they said, well, let's try a few different interventions to see if we can help change that. And so what they did is they offered two things. One was kind of a life coach, right? Someone who could help provide some mentoring and support, both to navigate through the post-secondary environment, community college specifically in this case, but also the other things in life that you need to manage in order to continue your education. And then they also provided stipends for incidental expenses, right? A technology device breaks, some sort of maintenance on a car, groceries, some of these things that unfortunately, when you're resource constrained, you have to make trade-offs in how you spend those. And what they found is that with that life coach and with what equated to on average about $600 a year and kind of what the average stipend ended up being, they were able to take the retention rate from 40% to over 75% for that cohort of people that received just those two interventions. And so something like that is pretty impressive in terms of seeing a lift. None of it really had to do with tutoring or academic performance. It really was these other factors right around the education experience that really helped see a marked improvement. And so that's one example of something that we've seen be successful even here in the state of Tennessee. And what's exciting is we're in the midst right now of MemWorks of doing two things. One is we're saying we've got this data analysis, but we need to understand what the lived experience is that goes with that. So we're actually going out and talking to all the workforce service organizations, trying to understand what's their experience, trying to provide these services and kind of the challenges they face. And they're also talking to the population experiencing poverty to understand as you try and go through these employment pathways, right? What are you experiencing? How does that align with what we're seeing in the data? What's maybe something that doesn't show up in the data that is consistently being experienced by people trying to traverse those pathways? And then on top of that, we're then going and saying, okay, well, we study the data to understand what the problems are. We're studying the data to understand what the solutions are. So we're looking at what's been researched to address adult literacy effectively. What's been researched to say what's really effective at enabling a workforce ecosystem to work together more efficiently. And then we're looking at what's been done in other communities across the country to be able to say, well, hey, for instance, in New Orleans, they were able to implement this particular intervention or set of interventions, and they saw meaningful improvements in one of the roadblocks that we see here in Memphis, with the goal being that, business-minded as we are, putting together a business case of saying, hey, here's a problem in Memphis that's inhibiting people experiencing poverty from reaching living wage jobs. Here's the evidence that supports that. Here are the opportunities we have based on what's been researched and what's been done in other cities. And specifically, here's what we can do in Memphis, the stakeholders that need to be involved, the funding and policy implications. So that business case gives us a very clear roadmap of how to address that and actually do something about it. Because the last thing I enjoy, the thing I hate, I guess, the last thing I enjoy, the thing I hate is, hey, there's a problem, and we leave it at that. That's not how I function. I need to know, what do I do, right? I want to go be empowered to go do something about that. And that's what MemWorks is all about, is not just identifying these roadblocks, but what can we go do? John, what would you add to that?
I would just underscore this idea that, our goal here is twofold. One is really understanding how these roadblocks translate into the experiences of participants going through the program. That to us is just so critical. And I think that often in other initiatives like this, that can be a side that might be ignored. We know what the issues are. It's easy for us to kind of identify. Here, we're really trying to come up with solutions that make sense for the people that actually need those solutions. And I think that is absolutely critical. And then the second thing that I'll say, and I agree with you, Jared, 100%, there's nothing worse than identifying a challenge and then not coming up with a solution. But here, our solutions are going to be informed by evidence. They're going to be informed by things that have been demonstrated to work in other places and then contextualized to make sense for Memphis. And that's really powerful because at least there's something behind it that says, you know what, we've tried this in other places and it has made a difference. So let's apply it to what's happening in Memphis.
Absolutely. Well, where do we go to carry these conversations forward, to find the findings and to be a part of the solutions and the activation? So where do we go to stay in touch, but also get involved?
Yeah, fantastic. So we've created a website called memworks.org, memworks.org. And that's where you can learn more about this project, and all of our findings are being published there. From there, you can join a mailing list and we'll send you regular updates. You can also follow Slingshot on our Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram profiles. We provide regular updates on MemWorks through that. You also can continue to support this work. So it's costing us resources, right? And we're a nonprofit ourselves, just like MDRC. And so you can also say, hey, I really care about that and excited about it, and invest in us to support us being able to continue to do this work and do it at a very high level. Our bar is to be as high quality as we can possibly be, not just good for Memphis, not just good for the nonprofit space, but good, period, in terms of the rigor and quality that we try and take to this. Because in our view, if we're going to spend that much rigor trying to make money as a society, why would we not spend that rigor also trying to help improve the quality of people's lives?
Absolutely. Well, Jared, John, thank you for all you and your amazing teams are doing. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.